By the 1930s, however, Jerusalem's once shared spaces, residential neighborhoods, markets, public squares, municipal garden, religious shrines, and even bus lines, as well as the shared institutions like the City Council, Chamber of Commerce, Masonic lodges, professional guilds and organizations, had become largely separated along ethno-national lines. How did this happen? What factors were more or less important in this process? Was the timing similar or different for each of these individual processes? So my current book project really tries to pick up where my previous one left off. This new project is called Unmixing the Holy City, and it studies these and other questions stemming from the decades-long transformation of Jerusalem from a mixed city to a segregated city. And in doing so, I'm trying to connect a few dots that are missing in the field of Middle Eastern and urban studies. Without going into too exhaustive literature review, I'll just mention three major gaps that I'm talking about. One is in the history of the city itself, despite being arguably the most studied city in the entire Middle East, which becomes very evident once you look for it on WorldCat. There are significant absences and imbalances in the way that the history of the city has been written. Most notably, of course, the relative absence of Jerusalemites from the story of their own city. Social history tends to be really subservient to political, diplomatic, religious histories of the city. In terms of the city as a divided city, there are very good works that examine post-48 divided city and then the post-67 unified yet ethnocratic city. But the pre-48 dynamics really have been largely ignored. So moving out to look at the sphere of Jerusalem as an Ottoman city, although the heterogeneous mixed cities are very much part and parcel of the Ottoman imperial experience, and that's very well known, and despite the very really multi or really interdisciplinary tradition there is in Ottoman urban studies, there are still many unanswered questions about the urban contours of religious ethnic diversity and the intersection of power on the urban landscape. So I'm hoping that my study will also speak to this broader wave of Ottoman imperial urban histories. And the third sort of historiographic intervention that I want to do is to try to bring in some of this literature on urban segregation that tends to be focused on North American urban cities, particularly looking at the black-white segregation divide, but also colonial cities, and to see how an imperial city in a very different time setting with very different factors might be able to clarify some of these questions about changing scales, aggregating differences and causality, the meaning and value of segregation and integration for different groups, and expanding the questions beyond residential segregation to look at other kinds of urban contact zones and measures. So those are the main places where I see myself as trying to speak to. Okay, so now we're going to shift from this fictional family to an actual historical Jerusalemite family. According to a local Jerusalemite tradition from Ottoman times, babies born on the same day in the same quarter would be brought by the midwife to be nursed by each other's mothers, a ritual act that thereafter made them lifelong foster brothers. Their families developed close ties, visited each other on holidays, exchanged ritual gifts, and served as part of each other's urban social networks. So when Zuleika Hanem, the wife of the government clerk Faid Allah al-Alami, who is seen here with his two children, was due to give birth to their second child, Musa, she left her spacious home outside of the city walls in this new neighborhood of Musrara, right out here, to go to her parents' home inside the walled city here in Al-Wad to give birth. So as a result, Musa was born down the street from the son of the Jewish grocer, and those two became lifelong milk brothers. According to Musa's memoirs, the two families remained in close contact for over 20 years, until the early 1920s or the late 19-teens, when growing nationalization and conflict in British-ruled Palestine brought an end to their fictional and ritualized urban brotherhood. Now, other than al-Alami's memoirs, there's no paper trail to attach to this tradition of neighborhood foster brothers. No receipts in the state archive, no mention in contemporary newspaper accounts, no list in municipal records, and no corroborating or dissenting account from the other party. So in one sense, it's an archival dead end. But I highlight this story for two reasons. First, because it underscores the importance of proximity and relationality in our understanding of space and the urban experience. As the authors of an interdisciplinary survey of the spatial turn have recently put it, I'm quoting, geography matters, not for the simplistic and overly used reason that everything happens in space, but because where things happen is critical to knowing how and why they happen. To that I would add, and with whom they happen. In other words, we must take seriously that the mere fact of physical location created and sustained networks of positive and negative relations, contacts, and everyday interactions, most of which are otherwise absent from the historical archive. In addition to the example of foster brothers that Al-Alami talks about, he also talks about many other examples as well as other memoirs that we have from the time period and from his generation, who recalled the multiple ways that individuals were embedded into their neighborhoods and among their neighbors. Ritual visits and food exchanges were made to new residents. Neighbors played a socially expected role in family celebrations, mourning, and daily socializing, and the security of shops and homes, as well as family honor, were left in the hands and under the watchful eye of one's neighbors. In addition, we also have records that, of course, in the 1929 riots that shook Palestine, in many cases, neighbors sheltered and protected the families in their midst from the violence. So with such important and varied roles for neighbors, we know surprisingly little about their relationships and about neighborhoods, where neighbors lived, how they used their space, how they navigated their environments. So in order to get a finer-grained understanding of the social landscape of the city on this more microscopic level, as well as to better contextualize these kinds of anecdotes and episodes that are captured in Al-Alami's and other memoirs, I turn to the 1905-1906 Ottoman Census, the Nüfus, and a series of HGIS maps that I generated from it. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with GIS. HGIS is Historical Geographic Information Systems, but essentially there's two components. You have a historical map that is then georectified to its physical location in space, and then a series or a set of data that is relating to that map. And it could be census records, or it could be property records, or tax records, or any other kind of thing. By making space an explicit part of historical analysis, over the past decade and a half, HGIS has shown itself to be a promising tool for historians, allowing us new ways to approach and interrogate the spatial experience and spatial practice in past urban societies. By zooming into the neighborhood, street, building, and household levels, it illuminates structural patterns as well as possibilities for daily interaction and contact, which are necessary elements of a more nuanced vision of urban segregation. By closely examining demographic and spatial patterns in the neighborhood, we reveal the very important, if uneven, roles that millet, city of origin, and class played in the late Ottoman urban landscape. Perhaps more promisingly, through the dynamic layering and analysis of various kinds of historical data from multiple archival fragments, HGIS allows us to examine historical relationships embedded in physical space in both quantitative and qualitative terms. So in the time that remains, I'm going to go through a few different slides to show you a little bit about the way that I've been using this census and the mapping of the census to try to rethink, to try to peel back the layers, so to speak, of the experience or the Jerusalem that Al-Alami describes, or that are described in the memoirs of Khalil Sakakini, Wasam Jahariya, and many other people from that same generation, the turn of the 19th to 20th century. So just very briefly on the Ottoman census, the Ottomans carried out two major empire-wide censuses, I guess, one in the early or mid-1880s, and the second that ended 1905, 1906, 1907, sort of ended in different years, different parts of the empire. The government both incentivized participation and punished the lack of participation, and scholars of the census really tend to think that this is the better. The 1905, the second census, is the more thorough census of the two. And we do see from the census records that we have vast participation from the elite level to the middle level, these new white-collar educated middle classes that are emerging in the late Ottoman period, as well as the artisanal and even the impoverished classes, so many people who show up as being illiterate, or who show up as living in public housing projects. And I should also mention, of course, that you have your very own historian who's worked extensively on the Ottoman census in a different part of the empire, İpek Yosamaoğlu, and of course it's very interesting work that she has done. I'm going to be talking about the census in a little bit more of a positivistic way today, even though I think we can and should always be aware of the problems of that. And I'll just point out a couple of things about the census. So in order to use HGIS, you need to have very specific kind of geographic location coordinates. And I've had a number of, in the years that I've been doing this, I've had a number of very challenging conversations with geographers about how to make up for this given the sort of scarcity of information and the weak data that we have as historians. But the neighborhood that I've ended up working on, Al-Wad, which was the neighborhood that Musa al-Alami was born in the Old City, actually turned out to be a really good neighborhood. First, it was the most religiously and ethnically mixed of all of the Jerusalem neighborhoods in this time. Secondly, in contrast to some of the other neighborhoods, it had pretty good locational data within it, so that it had sub-neighborhood, or in this case it's really street-level information, as well as housing information for the majority of the residents, which enables us to get much more precise, like the geographers like to see that. So you have a lot of sort of biographical information, and I'll sort of talk about some of that in a moment. But another interesting thing that has just come up in the census is that you also get marginal comments that are much more interesting, I think a richer texture than just the quantitative kind of data that you can get from this. So somebody will be referred to as a muhtadi or muhtadiya, so the convert, which is very interesting because it then marks them in a certain way textually, socially, as well as linking them to other communities. You also have information scattered about people's marriages to other people, which enables us to link different households in the city. So there's a lot more that can be done than just a simple positivistic kind of treatment of it, but that's what I'm going to show you right now. So I'll just briefly mention a couple of things about the aggregate census. There are a couple of Israeli demographers who had worked on the aggregate census. One of their work is better than the other. But this map is similar to one that I had published in my first book, drawn from that aggregate census. And what I was really struck by when I was doing my earlier work was the fact that it really did illustrate that, counter to the vision that we have of Jerusalem as being timelessly divided into these four sealed, hermetically sealed communities or neighborhoods, what we see that it was much more mixed than that. In the Old City in particular, you have neighborhoods that have a significant representation of at least two, if not three, of the religious groupings. In the New City, this is a little bit different. And in fact, what we see is that you have, other than right outside here, and a little bit here, so right around the city wall area, the further out you go, the more homogeneous these neighborhoods become. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but it's just important to keep in mind that the extramuros expansion, which begins to take place already in the 1860s, is going to have a very uneven impact on the different individuals and different religious groups in the city. So I'm just going to spend the next couple of minutes that I have left identifying a little bit about what I saw in the census study and what that meant for my understanding of the neighborhood and of Jerusalem. So first of all, this is just a picture of Al-Wad, and I'll just briefly mention that Al-Wad was very important socially, culturally, economically, politically. It's really the center of the Old City, the location of the Ottoman government house, as well as military headquarters were not far from there. You have lots of consulates that are close by or within the neighborhood, and the most important markets are either within the neighborhood or on its borders. And you have a number of religious shrines belonging to numerous different sects that are within the neighborhood or immediately adjacent to it. Of course, there's the Haram al-Sharif here, the Western Wall down here. So it was a very important central area. You also have, of course, significant sort of urban social life. So cafes are located here. The Khalidiyya Library is located in this neighborhood, which becomes an important site for intellectual exchange, etc. Just a little bit of a micro snapshot of this neighborhood. It was the second most populous neighborhood in all of Jerusalem at this time, and as I said, the single most mixed neighborhood. And we see here that it was very heterogeneous in terms of the composition, not only religious composition, but also ethnic composition, linguistic composition. We have very interesting information that emerges about some communities that we don't often think about as being residents in late Ottoman Palestine, sub-Saharan African communities, Afghani and Indian Muslim communities who have arrived as well. I'm just going to have to skip that. So basically what I found, to distill it to the next minute or so, is that you have, even in this most mixed neighborhood in Jerusalem, this finer grained study and mapping of this data shows us that you have very uneven mixing. That you have areas that are highly segregated and areas that are much more integrated. So what this map here shows us is this area here is where 85% of the quarter's Christians lived, on these 3 streets, and even within that, and a small number of houses. The Christians were the most concentrated of all of the groups in the neighborhood, and they're, of course, adjacent to Harat al-Masada and Bab al-Amud, which are also 2 predominantly Christian neighborhoods. This map here shows us that you have a high concentration of Muslims to the east of Al-Wad Road, which borders, of course, the gates to the Dome of the Rock and the Haram Sharif complex as well. This one here shows the streets that were the most mixed, where you have the highest ratio of members of different religious groups, of different cities of origins, of different ethnic groups as well. And you can see that these are the main north-south and east-west axes into the neighborhood and connecting it to other places. So I'll just highlight 3 things that I wanted to keep in mind. Of course, the most important component, which I've left to the last minute, is the question of why. Why do you have these patterns of residential settlement? What I'm doing in my work is looking at some of the structural factors, so the question of property ownership. Many of these properties are waqf properties, so they cannot be sold, but they have to be rented. For the Christians, that's a key explanation as to why you have such high concentration. These are buildings that were owned by the Latin Patriarchate and the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, and for that reason, you have no inter-Christian mixing at the building level, so Christians live in buildings that are exclusively of their millet because of the property ownership issue. You also have a response by the Jewish community to this by creating an institution which is called chazakah, which is basically land lease rights, and this is used all over the Ottoman Empire and even in North Africa, but it's a rabbinical construct that was basically intended to enable the rabbis and the community leaders to have some control over Jewish use space and to be able to say, okay, these are houses that will only be rented to Jewish families. So you have very few mixed buildings in this neighborhood, but what's even more interesting is that we have very few buildings that are mixed across ethnic lines, even for all Jewish buildings. So this chazakah institution not only protected Jews from inter-religious cross-residential mixing, but also from intercultural mixing. So you don't have very many Ashkenazi and Maghrebi households living in the same buildings. Just another consideration that I've also been taking into account, of course, cultural and religious sentiments and considerations, as well as the issue of street morphology and public and private spaces and access to them. So just end with this last slide, which is just a suggestion of how we can layer different kinds of textual sources onto these more quantitative sources like the census. And this shows us here the memory map that was drawn in the memoirs of Guy Frumkin, who becomes later Chief Justice in British ruled Palestine, but who grew up in Al-Wad, this neighborhood just around the corner from the Al-Alami family. And what we see here is we can have sort of the locations that the residences that he's marking, the businesses that he's recalling. And so these kinds of memory maps from people's memoirs give us a real insight into how they saw and experienced the city. And so it's interesting not only what is remembered, but what is forgotten or what is erased. And so it's quite striking to contrast the places that he acknowledges and the places that he doesn't acknowledge in their existence. So just to conclude, these layered maps can indicate change over time, which is of course critical to understanding whether or not the kinds of patterns of integration and segregation that we see in Ottawa were transitory in the life of the city or in the lifetime of its residents. Much more work needs to be done on this question, to be sure, but the direction of better understanding the historical urbanist experience necessitates a dialogue between quantitative and qualitative sources, attention to macro and micro scales, and a critical engagement with digital spatial analytical tools.